Conversation around suicide may involve such topics as trauma, child abuse, sexual abuse, and death by suicide. Viewer discretion is advised.
Larry Berkowicz. We do not call him doctor, although we could officially call him Dr. Berkowicz. Larry is the co-founder of Riverside Trauma Center. I've had the great honor of working with him for, I think, about 9 years now. He has provided direct therapeutic services for over 20 years and managed mental health services for over 15. His clinical areas of expertise includes working with children, adolescents, adults, and families who are trauma survivors and or suicide survivors. So with that, I will turn it over to Larry Berkowicz.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everyone. Thanks all for being here. And well, thank you to Sally, to Craig, to Isabel. And Craig and Isabel, your stories are powerful and pull at our hearts in an important way, which tells important stories. You know, I come to my work, as Sarah said, as a psychologist, as a professional, but also as a suicide loss survivor, having lost a family member and several friends to suicide. I think many of us in the field come to this work with a passion born out of our own experiences. And having heard these wonderful stories that have been coming from people's hearts, I just want to say, I'm going to go a little academic on you now and come back to our heads. Sarah had asked me to be sure to talk about some specifics, some specific information to help us know what to look for, what to think about, what to hear, what to listen for. I'm also going to talk about how we change the narrative when we're working with, living with, talking with young people in our communities. So, having said all that, actually, before we advance any slides, I'm going to ask you, here's where audience participation part, so get your fingers ready to do some typing. We've been talking a lot about suicide, suicidal thoughts, suicidal state of mind, suicidal actions. When you think about that and hear about that suicidal state of mind, what comes to mind? How could we define that? If we were to come up with a definition about what suicide is about, what would you say? A couple of words. How would you think of it? How do you define that? Let me just ask you to type into the chat, and I'll try to pick a couple out. Hopelessness, loss of hope. Wanting to end pain, hopelessness, sadness, desperately seeking relief. And misery, hopelessness keeps coming up. Yes, the wish to end life. Feeling disconnected, yep. Empty, relief from despair, absolute, wow, yep. Exactly, purposelessness. Actually, I saw somebody ask Craig this question, and Craig, you gave a great answer a few moments ago. You wrote that you believe we consider suicide because we want something to change, but feel incapable of changing it. No power to change something, Margaret just wrote. Exactly. Being misplaced. So I think you're all hitting this on this nail on the head. Can we advance the slide, please, Jen? And one definition that we've come to at our place at the Trauma Center that kind of helps us in thinking about it is this, that suicide is the attempt to solve the problem of intense psychological pain and that sense of hopelessness that many of you were just talking about, right? And it could be all kinds of things that bring us that pain, often, always, multiple things. We heard Craig talking about that. We heard Isabel talking about it, not necessarily even knowing where this comes from sometimes, and this sense that we just can't change it. Next slide, please. And when we think about suicide, there are all kinds of risk factors that contribute towards this state of mind and this risk. You know, and I could talk to you until 10 o'clock tonight about all the risk factors and drill down into them. I'm not going to do that. But we know these risk factors exist in the same way that risk factors might exist for cancer or heart disease, right? Doesn't mean that people who have these risk factors are necessarily going to die of suicide, just like having risk factors for heart disease doesn't mean we'll have a heart attack, but we know it increases the risk, right? And we know that lowering some of those risk factors or dealing with them might help reduce risk, right? So important to know and to think about. And in fact, I think we usually don't even talk about those things. We do identify them when it comes to some of the other physical issues, right? Like cancer, and we know what the risk factors are, and we try to help people change their behaviors. And we've been hearing some of them, the things like the social disconnection, right? How can we help people look at that and learn that they really need to do their best, and that families and friends and schools have to do their best to help support people's social connections to make to help decrease risk, to help increase resilience for people. Let's go on to the next slide. Sometimes people ask us, so how does this all come together? How would this all come together to lead to an actual suicidal event, someone making an attempt? This, again, I told you I was going to get a little academic, but this is a sort of a chain of events model that Madeline Gould, a colleague of ours at Columbia University, and some others have talked about that makes a lot of sense to me, so I want to share it. And where it starts is that people have some underlying vulnerabilities. Never one. And that's a really important thing to know, that there is never a single contributor that leads to suicide. It's always some combination of events, some perfect storm, if you will, of things coming together and impacting negatively on people. It sets the stage, and they can be there. And you heard Isabel, you heard Craig talking about them as they told their stories in that powerful way that they just spoke about them. And then there's often some stress event, some tipping point, if you will, something that we all see. That's the thing that the media reports on. The narrative becomes that someone lost their job and they killed themselves, or the relationship ended and they killed themselves. They didn't get into the college they wanted to, or whatever it is. But it's never that. And in fact, to attribute something to just a single cause becomes a dangerous narrative. You know, to say someone was bullied so they killed themselves leads to this narrative that people who are bullied kill themselves. Well, yes, it can be a contributing factor, but by itself, it's never sufficient by itself. And what happens is our thinking and the belief in the field that when that kind of significant event happens, it changes how we're feeling, this dramatic change in how we feel. So we're not just feeling hopeless, we're desperately hopeless. We're not just angry, we're enraged. We're not just embarrassed, we're humiliated. These big emotional changes, right? That could lead someone who's been thinking about suicide to act on those thoughts. Now, the problem is we don't always know who's been thinking about it, right? We'll talk about that more in a few moments. And then, you know, sadly, for some people, they might move towards acting on those thoughts. If there's easy access to a weapon, right? If there's no real taboo in their life against suicide, if they're alone, if maybe they've recently been exposed to a suicide death. But in some cases, it's inhibited, right? There's strong religious taboos or personal taboos. Or like Craig talked about, this strong belief somewhere that there's still reasons for living. So there's a whole bunch of things that can move people towards or away from suicide. So just this model that kind of moves, that shows how this could unfold over time. Next slide, please. So we know, actually, before I talk about this, I want to say something else, which is, I thank you for those of you who contributed some questions beforehand. And one of them was, so how many young people are actually thinking about suicide? I was going to avoid all the numbers and demographics, but since a couple people asked, I'll take the opportunity to answer a couple of those questions. In Massachusetts, as many of you know, and nationally, there is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and where we ask young people lots of questions about health behaviors and drugs and alcohol, all kinds of things. And some of those questions are about mental health issues and about suicide. So so young people are asked, you know, a question like, have you felt so, I'm looking at my notes here, have you felt so sad or hopeless for 2 or more weeks in the past year? And 33% of students in Massachusetts, high school students, indicated that they had felt sad or hopeless. And what might that be a sign of? Well, right, depression, right? So about a third of our high school students tell us they may have had some experience of depression in a given year. And when asked how many seriously considered suicide, in Massachusetts, 17.5%. The national rate was just a percentage above that. So that's a fair amount of young people when you think about the number of students in your high school, in your community's high school. That's a fair number of people. 7.3% of students said that in Massachusetts, that they had actually made some type of attempt, whereas about 2.5% said it was some kind of attempt that actually required medical support. So we know this is an issue. A lot of people, a lot of young people are engaging in it. You saw Sally's statistics telling us that it's the second leading cause of death among young people in our country, and true in Massachusetts as well. There have been questions about how this relates to the pandemic that we've been dealing with, and the CDC released some information just recently of surveys that were asked of, this was mostly adults, in the period from April through the end of June. 40% of adults said they were experiencing increasing drugs and alcohol use. They were experiencing increased thoughts of suicide, depression, and anxiety. Probably no surprise, right? I think we have to be careful not to talk about it as an epidemic, but we are seeing those increases and need to be prepared to support people and to deal with it. Because some feelings of anxiety or depression are normative in a situation like we're all dealing with right now. And among the younger people, the 18 to, I think it was 24-year-olds, about 25% of them said that they had been thinking about suicide that they attributed maybe related to the COVID crisis that we're all dealing with. Well, so if the average norms we have are about 17% were thinking about it, it's gone up to 25%. So there is some increased thinking. There was a question too asking, has it been increasing? And yes, over the last 10 to 20 years, I think some of us have seen that in the news, among all ages, there's been up to a 33% increase in suicidal behaviors over the last 20 years. So yep, an increasing problem. I mean, the good news is the numbers are still relatively small, but it's absolutely an increasing problem. Now, often we talk about depression related to suicide, and you heard Isabel talk about that, right? Now, she's answered about all the questions I'm about to ask you, which is, if we think that suicide is a leading potential cause of suicide, contributor to suicide, we probably want to be able to notice it and be on the lookout for what might be warning signs of suicide, depression. So let me ask you, again, I'll ask you to type this in. When you think about depression, what do you see? What do you notice if someone is experiencing depression? Just brief couple of words. What are you noticing when someone's depressed? Crying, crying and withdrawn, lethargy, that loss of pleasure of things, isolating, feeling invisible, exhausted, apathy, isolation. Lethargy keeps coming up, yes, and this withdrawing from life, being quiet and withdrawn, absolutely. Anhedonia, that's that sort of lacking of feeling, any feelings. Anger, that's an interesting one. Often people who are depressed become irritable and angry. We don't often think about that as connected to depression. Change in temper, irritability in teams. Yep, y'all know this. There's a wisdom in our communities, absolutely. Sometimes substance use. You got it. Not finding joy, this feeling of not being able to find joy, exactly. So we know that please advance the slide, that there are a lot of things that we could be looking at. Next, yeah, thanks. So exactly, I think you got all these. Low self-esteem, the boredom and low energy. You know, kids often will describe that as feeling bored. That's their expression for it. Sometimes it becomes somaticized, right? It becomes physical. Some kids will say they can't, well, you heard the example of not sleeping well, not eating. I feel sick to my stomach. I get headaches. Sometimes we feel it in our bodies, that sense of hopelessness, social isolation. Next slide, please. The sensitivity to rejection, difficulty. Yeah, there's just a whole long list, right? And we all know them. And the point in listing them is just not to say that if someone is depressed, that they're going to die of suicide. That's not the correlations. We know there's some increased risk. So we should know about it. Just like we want to know if there's any other contributing factors, we want to know about them to recognize them and deal with them. Next slide, please. So what might be warning signs actually of someone actually moving a young person more towards suicide? Because, Craig asked the question, well, why didn't you talk about it? Often young people won't. Adults often won't talk about it, right? But sometimes we get the message in other ways. Sometimes it's there verbally and we don't always hear it. Sometimes we don't acknowledge it. Isabel gave a great example of saying stuff was going on, but her parents didn't really know how to deal with it. It sounded like at the time, or just thinking it would pass. But sometimes it comes out. Words like, I wish I was never born. I wish I could just go to sleep and not wake up. Sometimes it's a little indirect in that way. You'd be better off without me, kind of language like that. Sometimes we see it, our schools tell us they see it in English class, in journals, in essays, in writing, right? It'll come out. Or in artwork. Artwork gets dark and focused on sort of themes of death, perhaps, and especially if that's a change, right? Significant changes in school performance, although that could mean a lot of things. but we want to find out. We want to dig in a little bit more when we're seeing some of these. There's another, if we can advance more, hearing about the hopelessness, seeing increased anxiety and agitation. Although saying that, I want to acknowledge that we've been hearing for years now from teachers and families that a lot of our younger people are experiencing more anxiety in general, right? And especially around COVID. That withdrawal that you all noted, which could be related to depression, the rage, reckless behavior, and even some, simple things like giving things away. I won't be needing this prom dress, giving away the phone, prized possessions, putting things in order. These all could be the warning signs that somebody is getting closer to an act that they've been thinking about. Next slide, please. So where do we notice this? When we're looking, schools often, we do a lot of training at schools, teachers, and counselors will ask us, well, how do we see this? How do we spot it? Well, just like I was just saying moments ago, many times it's in the writing. Sometimes it's other students hearing from their friends. And one of the messages when we help support schools around suicide prevention training, one of the messages is this strong message is you can't keep this a secret. If you're hearing this from a friend or a peer, you gotta tell a trusted adult. So that's a message we're driving home a lot with young people. You can't keep it a secret. If you see it online, if you see it in your social media, you gotta let somebody else know if you're worried about a friend. We're asking schools, do they have policies and procedures? Do all the staff know how to respond and what to do? And to some of Sally's points earlier, are we focusing and really working on trying to celebrate and promote strength and resilience in our students? Let's go on. What's the message we teach young people? It's the same message we tell adults, which is to act when you're worried about someone. ACT is the acronym we use, right? To acknowledge that you're seeing signs that someone might be depressed or that we're worried about them or they're giving off some signs that they might be thinking about suicide. We want to just acknowledge we're seeing it and we're hearing it, right? We want to let people know that we care, that they're important to us and I care about how you're doing. And let them know. We want to figure out how to help. We want to give messages of help and hope. And you'll see the words I have in here a little later, which is not hokey hope, like, oh, there's a silver lining to every gray cloud, but really messages of hope. And we've just heard two pretty strong messages of hope from Isabel and Craig. And we want to let, and we know for kids, the T usually is about tell a trusted adult. For the adults, when we talk about the T in ACT, it's about talking. Talking to the person, especially if it's a young person, and letting them know we want to support them and we want to get help for them. We want to connect them with people that can help them, whether it's other trusted adults in their community, professionals, could be school counselors, could be clergy. Who are the people that we think can help them? If we're really worried about seriously worried about suicide, we absolutely want to connect them with professional clinicians if we can. Let's go on. So quickly, I just went through all those. These are some of the things we're looking for, the things that we might see, what to do about it. But another important message here is that when we're talking about suicide with young people and with adults in the community, we really, really want to be focusing on how can we change the narrative. And what I mean by that, the next slide please, is how can we talk about suicide in ways that kind of flip the message. Not only is it something we're worried about, but as Craig was talking about, that there may well be, and we believe there are, reasons for living. If suicide is an attempt to solve a problem, well, we're all probably pretty good as adults at helping people solve problems, and that's our work, to encourage social support, to encourage people to find support and help. And Isabel, I'm sorry you had to go through 10 therapists, but actually, Sarah has taught me an important message about thinking about therapists. Sometimes we'll hear kids or adults say, I tried therapy, I saw one person, I didn't like them, it didn't work. Sarah said to me that she often says to people, well, think about it like going out to buy shoes. If you try a pair of shoes on and they don't fit and hurt your feet, do you just say, I'm never going to wear shoes again? Of course not. You keep trying different pairs until you find one that fits well and is comfortable. Love that analogy, Sarah. Same thing about finding help. You got to find a fit that's going to work. We need to fight the stigma around mental health challenges. When I talk to young people in schools, I'm often asking them, if you were really struggling with an intense headache that lasted for days, what would you do? You'd talk to the school nurse, you'd talk to your parents, you'd get to the doctor, right? You'd get it checked out. Same, you have terrible stomachache that won't go away. You get help for it, right? But why is it when we have debilitating depression or anxiety, we feel somehow that it's a matter of character, that we've got to deal with it on our own? We've got to change the narrative around this stuff. That the message should be that nobody should ever feel like they're struggling alone, that no problem's too big to solve, that people are always here to work with you on these things. You can always talk to a trusted adult about this. We need more models like Isabel and Craig talking about how they struggled and how they've overcome and how they've pushed through. We need more people. People like Michael Phelps, arguably one of the greatest athletes ever, won more gold medals in the Olympics than anyone, right? He has been speaking out. You can find him online easily, speaking about his experiences with depression and anxiety and substances, and saying directly about how he's gotten help, and it's helped him live. It's helped him learn how to live through his depression. Similarly, Selena Gomez talks about how she's ended up in residential programs, and it has really helped her, and she's advocating for young people to learn from that and to get the help that they need. We need to really give this message that struggle is part of life, and we can get through those struggles. Let's change the slide. Thanks. So a lot of these things I just mentioned, you'll see this, and a lot of people have been asking about the slides. We will send you a link to the recording afterwards, but a lot of this is about helping people hold hope, giving messages, giving examples of hope, letting people know that the struggles feel enormous, but they are endurable, and that we can get through them and work through them together. Let's get to the next slide. Parents often are asking, what can we do? How can we deal with our worries if we've seen something we're worried about? Well, the answer is to talk about it, to ask questions, to ask our kids. Here's what I'm hearing. I'm kind of concerned. Just like we've learned to talk with our kids about drugs and alcohol and dating violence and driving safely, we got to raise this question too, and not just one time. It's got to come up. You can tell them you're watching this webinar and this came up, and here are some of the things you learned, and you're curious. If they ever were concerned about themselves or a friend, what would they do? Let's open the conversation. Let's have the conversation, and let's listen really well. Not necessarily give tons of our opinion, but listen. You heard the words earlier, with curiosity and care. And get help, seek help when we need it. I'm at the end of my time. I'm going to wrap that piece up, and I know Sarah's going to come back in, and this is a time we want to now, I think, hear from the rest of you. Thank you.
If you or a loved one are struggling with thoughts of suicide, these helplines are available toll-free.